Great pleasure to welcome you to today's, what are we calling it? Seminar? Lunchtime seminar. And we have here two very distinguished guests. I'll introduce both of them, and I'll tell you a little bit about why this particular seminar is so important for IDS. So first of all, my name is Anuradha Joshi. I'm the current interim research director here at IDS, but also a fellow in the governance cluster. And I am chairing this session, but unfortunately, I've got to leave at 2. So Suhaila is going to take over from me. I also know that some of you students have classes at 2, so feel free to leave, but do leave from the back door to create less disturbance. Okay, so over to our guests. So first of all, we have Dr. Imran Martin, who's the executive director of the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development at part of BRAC University in Bangladesh, based in Dhaka. But he's also a member of the White Paper Committee on Economic Reform in Bangladesh at the moment. And he'll talk a little bit more about the economic situation, etc. He's no stranger to IDS. He's been an alum of the economics department at Sussex University and has been a friend over a long period of time. So welcome, Imran, at this very critical juncture to speak about what's happening in Bangladesh. We also have Adnan Fakir, who's also no stranger to IDS. He's been for a while at Sussex. He's a senior lecturer in the economics department at Sussex, but he's also done his master's in Sussex. He's a founding member of Finding Bangladesh, which captures history of Bangladesh through creative means, including animation, videos, etc. And he brings a little bit of the creative spirit to this unfolding story of what's happening in Bangladesh. So as most of you know, Bangladesh is an important story at the current moment because over the past few years, we've had a lot of sudden transitions, but most of them have been sudden transitions which led to the fall of sort of emerging democracies. So for example, Myanmar, Afghanistan, etc. But here we have now slowly a few stories creeping in about sort of a re-emergence of democracy. And Bangladesh, I think, since the 5th of August student revolution is one such case when the long-standing Awami League that had been in power for, I think, about 15 years suddenly collapsed, and we have a new interim government in place. And similarly, Sri Lanka has been also undergoing a similar transition. So these are sort of really important cases to look at from the democracy point of view. But I think this story of what's unfolding in Bangladesh is also important to IDS because BRAC and Bangladesh has been a key partner in a lot of research work that happens in IDS, particularly the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, which has been doing research with us for many years. And this is another sort of step in the unfolding relationship, depending on what's happening next. So I really welcome all of you. Let me say one thing, that we're going to take pictures during this seminar. Obviously, it's being live streamed as well. But if you have any objections, what do we do if people have objections? They let her know. Let her know.
Priscilla know.
Let Priscilla know, so that she won't put your picture up on the web or won't use it for a particular thing. The way this is going to work after this introduction, so Hela is going to moderate a discussion by asking questions both to Adnan and Imran. And we will proceed from there, and we'll have a bit of time for Q&A from the floor at the end of this. So over to you, Suhaila. I didn't introduce you.
That's okay, I'll introduce myself. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Welcome to the seminar on Bangladesh 2.0, Resistance, Reform, and Reconstruction. As you know, this is going to be a moderated discussion. Anu has already told you what has happened in Bangladesh. Just a few things about what happened. It's important to remember that we had a 15-year rule by Sheikh Hasina's Army League, which increasingly became autocratic and institutions were undermined. The movement that led to the fall of the regime, it actually started as a very peaceful movement, and it was about quotas in government jobs. So 30% of the jobs were reserved for freedom fighters. So our liberation war happened in 1971 for them and their descendants. So this was removed in 2018 as a result of a movement, and then reinstated by the High Court, and the students started protesting. The protests started in public universities, and then they were brutally beaten up by the ruling party, Qaeda. The residences were closed down, and basically private university students then came out in support, and the movement gained support from other segments of the society. And it became a movement about justice and accountability, because the protesters were brutally repressed, not just physically attacked, but shot at, arrested, disappeared. And this was basically the Students Against Anti-Discrimination. This was a non-political platform. And the death toll from the short 3 weeks that we have seen is still going up. There are about 19,000 people injured. It is a critical moment for us. We have an interim government in power, and there are lots of expectations and hope in terms of how future may unfold. But as you know, after 15 years, if you start talking, you have a lot to talk about, and everyone's talking. So it's also about what do you prioritize, how do you prioritize? So what the speakers will do and what the questions are about partly is about their own personal experience, partly it's also about what's going on, what are the expectations of people, etc. So that's just the gist of it. So I'm going to start with Imran. Universities played an important role in this uprising, but they also play an important role in terms of producing knowledge, shaping understanding of people, etc. So could you tell us a little bit about the role of private university students in July? And you yourself were part of what was going on at that time, and so was BIGD. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. So it's really great to be back, as always. And from the audience, it's clear that there's a lot of interest in Bangladesh. And I think, I'd like to start actually there. I think Bangladesh has always been interesting, but I think now it's interesting in a very interesting way. I think for many years, Bangladesh has been interesting as a surprise case, as a development miracle, as a land of natural disasters and basket case, and microcredit and low-cost solutions to service delivery. But now I think Bangladesh is interesting because it is really questioning the way we can think about designing democracy. And I think that is extremely exciting. I think we are going back to very fundamental questions about history, about our own identity, about our fundamentals, such as the Constitution itself, and how do we really make things that are more people-centric in a genuine way. So I think it's from that point of view, it's sort of extremely exciting times for in an intellectual epistemic sense as well. I mean, not only in the sense of what actually is happening on the ground. So I just wanted to start off with that. So this whole talk has been kind of titled very ideas is great in coming up with sort of great ways of describing talk. So resistance, reformation, and reconstruction. And there was Dhaka right now is filled with writings on the wall. Graffiti. Dhaka is actually the new political graffiti capital of the world, I think. And it's been, that itself is fascinating in the way the writings on the wall and the new language has been created through those writings. And maybe Adnan and others can talk more about that. But one of the writings I remember basically talked about I mean, these words were there. I mean, the resistance and, reconstruction, reform was there. But there was another very interesting word, which was reversal. And I think it's really interesting because I think there is a real appetite to think about problems that need to be thought very differently. So we need to really reverse the way we've been thinking about problems as well. So I think there's a real appetite in Bangladesh right now in terms of actually, reversals in the way we have been really thinking about certain problems itself. And I think, I guess, we'll talk about some of that. Now, coming back to the question about role of private university, I mean, I think this is the first time, and private university in Bangladesh is barely 23 years old. It's not very old. And there's always been a division between public and private university. And, private universities, have been the narrative or the image has been that this is where, better off people and rich people's children basically go to study. Clearly, that is not what is the reality. And the reality is that private universities in Bangladesh are increasingly mopping up the new aspirational middle-class children. And I think this is why the private university felt a solidarity with the agenda of non-discrimination. Not directly, but from a sense of solidarity, right? And that is really unique because private universities haven't really been part of these type of public protests, but I mean, in the last few years, even during the Safe Road movement, private university students were involved, but not in such a central way, right? So private university played an extremely important role in terms of, kind of massifying the public university-led movement that started from the public university, but without the private university really, on the 18th of July, really getting to the streets, I think it would have been much more difficult to really get the much more mass people's involvement into this uprising. So I think in terms of creating the uprising, the role of private university has been extremely important. And for the future, I think we really have to think about public-private university in a far more integrated way, especially in the context of student government. And I think as we think about student politics in universities generally, and the conversation is really around public university and student politics, I think there's also very active conversation that needs to happen in terms of how do we also do non-partisan based, student-led private university politics and student government being formed within private university as well, because I think that's going to be an important part of the discussion.
Thanks, Imran, and thank you for pointing that out in terms of the connection between public and private universities. Just to flag that student politics back home, I'm saying it back home because I'm Bangladeshi, it used to be dominated by political parties a lot. So in a sense, where you learn about democracy and deliberation and all of that, because student government and sort of what gets decided at universities in terms of decisions you make, that is a key space. And if that gets very, very polarized and politicized, then it's very difficult to practice democracy. And there is a conversation that Imran was pointing out going on about what kind of student politics do we want? Because it's not just dominated by political parties. You also have political party goons who come and beat you up. If they don't like you, they control how residents' spaces are allocated and other things, and they make a lot of money. So there is an issue about safety and security and other bits, but it's also an important space where you learn how to be a citizen. And this movement was a youth-led movement that the adults followed, which is why it's quite interesting. But it's important to have that space and have that sort of wanting to protect that space also now that the space has opened up. I'm going to move to Adnan. So Adnan, you were here in July. You and I and Rashad was sitting in the audience we agonized over what to do. We went to demonstrations, but it was also about whether you would be marked by the regime. Can you go back home if you talk too much? So there were lots of discussions around strategies, but you were also very, very connected to what was going on back home in terms of organizing. Particularly, you also taught at BRAC, right? So could you tell us a bit more about how at Sussex we were organizing? Because Diaspora played a big role in terms of creating pressure, but also the kinds of knowledge that was being put through in social media and what was going on.
Yeah, thank you, Saurabh. Thank you for having me here. It's great to be here. I guess in terms of talking about the diaspora, it's good to get like a context first in terms of what was happening during the 15-year regime or the past decade. Firstly, there was in Bangladesh, we had something called the Cybersecurity Act or the Digital Security Act, which was very draconian in the sense that if you wrote against the government or if you were speaking out against the government, there was a chance that you would be taken away, interrogated, your family members would face the repercussions and so on. Against that context, a lot of the diaspora community, they're about the conflicting sources. Some say that we have 12 million diaspora worldwide, some say 15. So it's within that number, but it's a large body. A lot of people were not writing from within Bangladesh or outside in terms of what was happening within the country, especially if it was against the government. They were scared of writing, essentially. One of the things that exploded during this movement was this freedom of expression, of being able to write openly without fear. And a lot of that came from the diaspora community. All of us have been writing, and when we were writing about what's happening internationally and locally, a lot of our friends came to us and said that, "Are you sure you want to write this? You know, this," because at that point we had no idea that the government would be overthrown, right? They were like, "Your names will be tagged. You might not be able to go back to Bangladesh, or your family might be prosecuted or questioned in terms of, or targeted at least." Some of my friends in DC, when they were protesting in front of the Bangladesh embassy, one of the things they mentioned was that the embassy people were taking photographs and identifying people to identify their names. So there was a major sense of tension there in terms of even the protests. So, but the diaspora really got together. They were protesting everywhere. Afterwards, we learned of a circular that came out saying, and this was from the past foreign secretary, saying, mentioning that keep note of all these protests and use the diaspora community who are pro-government to push the counter narratives forward. So there was this entire misinformation, disinformation campaign. I think we'll get to that later on. The ways the diaspora really got together is ensuring medical aid was getting reached to people who needed it, contacting doctors, in Bangladesh, contacting foreign delegates in terms of updating them regularly what's happening, because we had that internet blackout. And if you were not really communicating over phone, which was itself really bad for quite a long time, no one was getting any updates in terms of what's happening. So that really, the diaspora really got together from there to the point where the protesters, the young protesters, I should say, had said that during the internet blackdown, you guys are our voice. So don't shut up, essentially speak out, keep on speaking. And this kind of solidarity from the diaspora to the local student movements actually gave a lot of encouragement to the students who were down on the streets as well. So we were part of a number of demonstrations in London in Alta Bali Park. Having said that, we were cautious in terms of joining demonstrations that were non-partisan because there were a lot of protests, I should say, in terms of from the opposition party as well as the pro-Arab League party intervening and giving threats to these demonstrations in various countries as well. So that played a major role into all of that. In terms of the graffitis that Imran Bhai was mentioning, that really played a role in terms of the movement, both locally and in the diaspora. People abroad were making new songs, and in particular rap songs, Bengali rap songs took a high precedence. A lot of people abroad were writing this, and this really sparked the movement and incited people in terms to start speaking, start writing. There were a lot of character assassination portraits as well, some of them duly, some of them not duly. But all of those were coming out finally. It was like after 10 years or 15 years of repression, people were finally being able to speak out, to be able to write. Yeah, I'll stop right there.
Yeah, thank you, Adnan. The creativity was amazing in terms of what happened during Uprising. If you look at the cartoons, if you look at graffiti writings, the songs, the memes, it's just like amazing stuff. And it's still going on. The visual strategies of protest is quite important in the way you reach people. And it's because of what the censorship laws that you were talking about that people haven't been able to do that. And suddenly all fear went away. We are always afraid. When it's an autocratic regime, you're afraid in different ways. And then you say things, but you say things sort of like this, right? Not direct, so that you won't get into trouble, your family wouldn't get into trouble, but there's always a point when it breaks. And I think with this uprising, what happened was the repression was so brutal, and there were kids dying on the street. You just couldn't, and the kids were so brave in terms of not being afraid to die. I'm saying it and it seems flippant, but it does trigger something in you to want to come out in solidarity. And it's that solidarity that became really, really important. So I'm going to move on in terms of, we are talking about our personal experiences, but I want to pursue you guys to talk about what's happening now and what's going to happen next. And there are many things. So my question is to Imran. Imran, BIGD has been doing pulse surveys, right, to look at people's expectations. I already said there's an interim government in power. There are 6 reform commissions. Reforms are from law and order to thinking about stabilizing the economy, to the reforming the banking sector, because the money has disappeared, as it always happens. But it's also around anti-corruption, thinking through about a new constitution, et cetera, et cetera. You yourself are a part of the white paper committee. But let's talk about the pulse survey first in terms of people's expectations and the current trends that you're seeing in terms of what are people saying. So could you tell us a bit more in terms of what's coming up?
Yeah. So we conducted this, we have been doing this, what we call a citizens perception survey since 2019 in partnership with the Asia Foundation, to look at, sort of democracy, governance, development, expectations and experiences of people. And it's a national representative survey, very carefully done and all of that. And we've been doing since 2019. So we did one, so the first round of pulse survey we did, after July uprising was, just about 15, 20 days after the 5th of August. After 5th of August. So it was actually very early on, and we are just doing we are designing another pulse survey, and we'll keep on doing this another 3 or 4 to really, kind of monitor the pulse and, hopefully be able to. So the trend is going to be much more important than a point in time, data. So if you look at the trend from 2019, so from 2019, we did one in 2019, which is interesting because it's pre-COVID and just after the election, 2018 election. And then we did one in 2022, which is also interesting because it's bang on at the COVID period. And then we did one in 2024, just after the election, last election. And then we did one right now, which is just after July 5th uprising. So what was really interesting is, of course, it's not unexpected that, people's aspirations in terms of, one of the questions we keep on asking is, how do you see the economic direction of the country and the political direction of the country? Separate questions. And it's not surprising that you see a big uplift in people's aspiration, expectation in terms of the economic and political direction of the country, especially compared to 2022 and 2024 data points, which were low points in all the 4 years that we've been looking at. So 2019 was quite high. there was the economic narrative and there was some economic, reality on the ground. Opportunities were actually, growing, though we had a terrible election in 2018, but I think people were still, quite optimistic. But I think that really fell in 2022 after COVID. Price hike continued until 2024. And then just now you see a real spike in terms of people's expectation. Now that part is not unexpected, but what is really interesting is if you unpack that, that headline and look sort of a bit more in terms of heterogeneity, a number of very interesting things basically emerge. I'll just say a few. So one is throughout the period, we see that women tend to have lower levels of optimism compared to men. Right? Throughout 2019, each and every year, women's expectation, or in terms of optimism, in terms of the economic political direction, is lower, somewhat lower, or kind of never higher, but lower. This gap has widened much more in the current time, right? So both men, women, the aspirations have gone up, but women at a much slower pace compared to men. Now, this is one data point. We'll be monitoring further and we'll see what happens, but there is a gender gap that we see growing right now. So that's sort of one. We see a number of reversals, two reversals. Throughout from 2019, in terms of these aspirations or optimism, economic and political optimism, we see that poorer people and people from rural areas were more optimistic in economic and political direction of the country compared to better off people. And here, better off in our sample is lower middle class. We're really talking about, it's not really rich. It's lower middle class, 30, 40,000 taka, per month annual monthly income. So that's really lower middle class, So compared to that income group, the poorer people always had more optimism until now. Right now, we see a reversal. We see that in the urban area, people are more optimistic than in rural areas. And better off people, and better off middle income, lower middle income, are more optimistic than the poorer segment. So there's actually a reversal right now. And again, one data point, we'll obviously monitor and see what happens. But I find this reversal and this gap, gender gap, that is growing to be quite interesting. And, we can talk more about that. I've got my own, interpretation, and maybe, Sohela can talk, on at least a gender gap, what that means. But I think this is really important to monitor, important to track, because I think the gender question is one that I think needs extremely strong focus right now in terms of any progressive outcome we want to basically move towards, because that to me is a litmus test in terms of what is going to actually go right or wrong in Bangladesh right now.
I can certainly talk quite a bit about gender if I want to, and we already had a discussion when I was in Bangladesh on this. But let me sort of push you on that. What are your interpretations in terms of why does this gap exist? I mean, we always know that and in this uprising, women were very, very visible. You have to think about the nature of patriarchy that we have back home, and public space is, public generally means men, right? And you don't always see women in protests and demos. It's not that they don't go out or there aren't feminist organizations and women's organizations that a very strong, vibrant women's movement in Bangladesh. There is, but generally this form of protests, street protests, are dominated by men. But this uprising, you saw initially public university female students coming out when the men were locked up in their residences and didn't know what to do. You saw initially the idea is always that, if the goons or the police attack, they won't attack women. That's a myth, because they got targeted, beaten up, attacked. And you also saw female students going out physically and protecting the male students from attack, and also leading stuff when the men were not there, whether that's sit-in, roadblocks, coming out at night to protest. And these are huge things in terms of claiming public space. And there are a number of female student coordinators. So when the movement spread from the public universities to private universities, you had coordinators. So this was a very diffused leadership, and women did come to the forefront. But we also know from lessons from other transitions, just because you're visible in participation doesn't always translate into you have a seat at the table. And what we are seeing right now in Bangladesh, I mean, the student coordinators are quite visible, but we don't always see the female student coordinators speaking out. You mainly see a lot of the male student coordinators. There are in the interim government 4 female advisors, which is great, but that's out of quite a few, only 4. There are also alarming discussions in social media, and we'll come to you, Adnan, on that. But there's a lot of moral policing about female advisors or female student coordinators. I mean, when they were very vocal during Uprising, that was great. You know, these women are like tigresses. That's what the public discourse was. And now that if you're vocal, why are you talking so much? You also see that. Lots of comments on female leaders, about female leadership, because Sheikh Hasina was a woman, sort of saying, oh, well, we have seen female leadership, without talking about that, well, the rest of the leaders in Awami League were men. What about them? So we are seeing these trends, and it does make you worry, right? And then you sort of see also the gap, and the gap is quite significant in the survey, like in terms of the points that you see in terms of what people are expecting from the new state. And we are talking about an inclusive system, right? So Imran, what are your thoughts on why do these gaps exist?
Well, I'm sorry, yes, I am. No, I think you alluded to, you know, quite a few dynamics here. And it's one, too, I think we need to really watch this space very carefully and understand and unpack it. I mean, I think there are, so another data point I'll just give you before I give a bit more interpretation from my point of view. So another data point is if you unpack this whole gender gap a bit more from our survey, what we see is the gender gap is primarily in optimism, is primarily constituted by people, by women in the higher, in our case, higher means lower middle income category. It's basically driven by, you know, people who are slightly better off compared to poorer people. So what really is happening, and this is understandable, right, in terms of aspiration, in terms of mobility, in terms of, you know, kind of livelihood pressures. I think it is, for women, it's much more I mean, for the poorest, I think it's sort of very different compared to the way you have to navigate the public space compared to those who are in the lower middle income category. Navigating the public space for livelihood is far more, you know, far more critical. So it's sort of no wonder that we see most of the, you know, most of the gap coming from slightly better off women compared to the sort of the poorest. Now, in terms of interpretation, I think, I mean, I don't think things have become worse factually. I think what is happening is there is more, I think, you know, there's a more emboldenment of certain types of expressions which need to be addressed, I think, quite clearly. And I think the lack of addressing those is the real issue here. I think it's a very small minority with very big noise, creating very big noise through social media and amplifying this. But this needs to be addressed. And I think this is where, you know, one of the critical areas where I think we need to quickly get things working is our security, is basically our police reform. That's one of the most fundamental reform that needs to happen. Our police force, because it was the most politicized force, it was actually the face of violence and brutality, got, you know, the kind of biggest backlash and has been the most demoralized and, you know, are in the deepest trouble and most complicated to reform. So reforming this is going to be really, really important if you really want to address some of these emboldenment kind of regressive type of emboldenment that we are basically seeing right now, which I think is not what Bangladesh is.
Thanks, Brian. I think partly, I mean, for me, if I think about the gender gap and why it's there, I mean, partly like the survey looked at both gaps in terms of economics and gaps in terms of what do you expect from politics, right? One of the key things in terms of when we were discussing why is there a gap in terms of expectations around economy improving and why are women feeling the pressure more? Partly it's about the role you play. You manage the household budget. Prices have gone up. It's partly about sectors you're engaged in and where is employment, right? And whether women are part of those sectors and what do you feel in terms of what does future hold? It's partly about insecurity. So you talked about law and order. So it's about if you're being morally policed, but also physically attacked when you're trying to go to your place of work. What does that mean, right? So those are reflected in terms of what you have. But also politically, like if you think about what you were saying, that, okay, we are hearing certain discourses from very conservative quarters about female leadership, about where women actually should be and they should be at home, so it does affect in terms of you do worry, given that the space is now open and you don't know what's coming next, that would that future include you and your agenda, right? So the survey also definitely reflects that.
If I may just add one thing, I mean, this is the woman and labor market, especially urban female women's labor market dynamics have been in trouble since COVID times, right? So this is something we've been following for a while now, this is where the real women's employment, not real agriculture, women's employment is also important, but this is where I think some of the norm shifting employment really happens in the urban space, right? And this is where women's labor force participation have been reducing, is stalled since COVID, right? So the economic pressure, I think, really got even worse, if you like, and the economic pressure, particularly on the new poor, or the lower middle income category. For the poorest, they have ways of adjusting. They can go for even more insecure forms of job and things like that. Adjustments can be precarious, but the adjustments are still possible. Here it's much more difficult. So I think so. The what we are picking up may have a longer arc, that we need to really sort of unpack here. And yeah.
I mean, we can talk a bit more about institutions and spaces for people engaging, and I will come to that. But just wanted to sort of say for my colleagues who are working on the backlash projects, both Yerker and then Tessa and Deepta, I can see, and Priya and Chloe, we are all, and Ben, we are all familiar with moral policing and the power of moral policing and what it does, and the power of discourse, even if it's not physically happening, and also gender-based violence, right? Targeted violence because you step outside of the norm. But then we have also seen violence against minority groups, and we'll come to that in terms of law and order and security. But I do want to get to Adnan, because one of the spaces where this kind of violence unfolds is online, right? Misinformation is spread, disinformation is spread, including about this event. I know that you guys have been tagged as Islamofascists. Welcome to online attacks. But Adnan, we started something in July, and we are continuing to look at basically data on Facebook and sort of scrape the data, not just in terms of narratives and counter narratives that are being formed, but also trying to understand who's spreading the disinformation, what kind of misinformation is being spread. And then in that skirmish also, there's that little incident where you got into Twitter warfare, which you may want to elaborate on or may not want to elaborate on, in the fear of being tagged again as Islamofascist. do you want to talk about a little bit about the project, what was going on in social media, what role social media played, but also the Twitter warfare, if you can?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, again, what was happening during the movement was it was a very emotional led movement, right, in every step of the process, and it's meant to be like that. Just some personal recollections of what was happening is even when we were mentioning females being in the front line, one of the cultural shifts that happened in terms of females being in protests on the ground is previously they used to not be attacked. They used to be kind of like the shelter point. That has changed during this protest. A lot of female students were attacked. There were incidences where a lot of the goons from the government went to female dorms and threatened them that if you don't leave the dorms by tomorrow, we'll come back and break your legs. And that was accompanied by essentially beating up the guard of the female dormitories and so on. So there were a lot of incidents like that. There were deaths among female protesters as well. But so all of these were emotional triggering points. And one of the key emotional triggering points that happened was using misinformation and disinformation to kind of shape the narrative in terms of what was happening. So the project we have been doing is, so we're now scraping all the public data available on Facebook from the 1st of July till right after the uprising. Well, the government was overthrown, so for 45 days. And so we have about 2.5 million data points about now, which is difficult to analyze all of that together. But one of the advantages is that a certain portion of that does have the gender associated in terms of who's commenting or sharing that post as well. And that plays a role. And maybe we'll talk about that later on. But we haven't analyzed the disinformation completely as of yet. So take whatever I'm saying with a grain of salt. This might change with the whole picture. But there were, especially in terms of minority violence, in terms of attacking Hindu temples, Ahmadiyya mosques, and other places, which has happened. It's not that it has not happened. Okay, and there is a big concern in terms of policing these areas as well. A lot of students did come forward to offer that, but that's not sustainable. We need institutional faces in there. But that has been leveraged to push that misinformation and disinformation agenda massively. There are a number of reports out there by now saying or identifying that a lot of this was pro-government led, so Army League led movements. We know that just in the last week of July, the amount of spending by the Army League government in terms of boosting social media posts was about 34,000 USD on many different posts, a lot of them on these particular campaigns. So that information is public, so we know how much spending is being done by whom. So just to give examples of what kind of posts were being moved forward, one that really caught on was a mass grave being found behind the parliament, which was completely misinformation. That did not happen. There were posts about statues being, Rabindranath Thakur statues, the bust of the head being demolished. That was old news. So a lot of old photographs were being used. In terms of a Hindu woman being burnt, that was completely out of context, but that really sparked the emotions. People latched onto those stories to show that, hey, what's happening right now, it's not good. This uprising movement is going to have consequence. And that was essentially the counter narrative that was trying to be spread there. Having said that, I do not want to lessen the importance on all the attacks that are happening at the moment. There are attacks happening, but at the same time, a lot of communities are coming together trying to protect these. We just had puja a few days ago, and a lot of my Muslim friends, majority of them, went to these festivals, not just in solidarity. So those kind of issues are happening at the moment. In a very small analysis of roughly about 500 of these posts that we just looked at, this is in correspondence with AFP, Fact Check, as well as Boom, which Meta uses essentially. We found that about 70% of these posts that were shared that had millions of views were actually incorrect. They were either misinformation or disinformation in some form or the other. So that's a massive amount that was being spread. The Twitter war was interesting. There's a hashtag that's even now kind of like moving ahead. If you go to Twitter and search Save Bangladeshi Hindus, it's still there. It's still going on, right? And the counter narrative was essentially students during the protests, and this happened primarily in August, okay, right after the government was overthrown, right before that and after that. So that was happening. They were going to different temples and they were standing guard outside and so on. And the Twitter was between saying that, hey, Bangladeshi Hindus are safe versus Save Bangladeshi Hindus. And this was happening for quite a period of time. We took a massive part in that movement in terms of all my students and my friends in Bangladesh. They went to different temples and mosques and standing guard for sometimes 2 weeks in that case, just to be there in solidarity. So that was the kind of ground level movement that was happening. But these are mostly in urban spaces. In rural spaces, the scenario was different. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, recently, the sharing of misinformation, disinformation has not gone down. It's still there, it's still progressing. I cannot speak after August because that's where really our data scraping stops. But till August, we know that that campaign was still ongoing, and we know that there is still money being spent behind these ads. Yeah, there are other points, but I'll stop here because the gender dimension is still being analyzed, so I won't comment on that yet.
Yeah, hold on to that. It's just a very, very complex picture in terms of what's going on in social media, both Facebook, Twitter, and all the other different platforms, who's putting what kind of messages out. There are groups that are pro and against people. Misinformation has been put out by both sides.
Yes.
That's also important to remember, but it's also basically you have a country that is going through transition, and it becomes quite dangerous when you have posts that incite hate quite a lot without any factual basis. Let's move on to institutional reforms. So Imran, you are a member of the White Paper committee. You guys are looking at economic reform, but also what has happened in the last few years. What can you tell us in terms of how the process has been set up? How are you engaging? Because we did say this is going to it's Bangladesh 2.0, right? We are going to create inclusive systems. We are going to create systems that are not discriminatory. We are going to engage citizens, and deliberation is going to be a big part of it. So how have you set up the process? Yeah. What's going on? Could you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, I can tell you about processes, but in terms of what we are finding, you'll have to wait because it's a work in progress still. So this is, first of all, this is one of the first, I think, committees that were basically set up under the leadership of Debapriya Bhattacharya. There are 12 of us who are part of that writing, the writers group. So the purpose is actually, very much in the tradition of white paper work that is done in Britain, right? So the idea is very much to it's an exercise of transparency. So the idea is to basically not to talk about the future, what is to be done. That is not the purpose of the white paper. The purpose of the white paper is to really understand where we are right now. Where we are right now, and how did we get to where we are right now? What are the key mechanisms through which we got to where we are now? And the hope is that by identifying those mechanisms through which we got to where we are right now, we'll be able to then, kind of figure out, how do we ensure that these types of mechanisms can be addressed in the future. So that's the purpose of the white paper. Now, the reason why we had to really do this white paper, even in the UK, the white paper's done, every government coming to power wants a group of experts to look at the state of things, before they want to know what they have inherited, right? I mean, that's what the interim government wants to know. What have we inherited? Now, that's a very valid question for any new government who comes to power would like to know, what have we inherited, independent view of what we have inherited, above and beyond what we know based on the data that exists. In the case of Bangladesh, I think the biggest challenge is what we know is manufactured largely, right? So we can't really trust what we know because there has been manufacturing of data. There's been malgovernance in the way the data has been handled, the data has been interpreted, and used, and so on and so forth. And there is a lot of inconsistencies. And I think, especially those who deal with data know this very well, starting from our GDP growth rate to inflation to even the population number. So some of the most fundamental numbers that you need to do any type of, looking at, the state of the economy are problematic. So I think the biggest work that we will do, this white paper committee, is really on the data side. Why are we in this state, and what are the problems with our data? And aside from giving a sense of where we are right now in terms of how big is the hole we're in, how deep and how wide, and so on and so forth, and how we got here, we are going to be focusing quite a lot in terms of how do we get to a better data governance in the future, because data is power. Ultimately, data will have to be a fundamental way in which we build deliberative democracy, right? And we need to liberate data. We need to democratize data and get data to be credible and accessible, and use the power of data to drive deliberative conversation and deliberative democracy. So that is where I think the biggest contribution, hopefully, the white paper will make.
Thanks, Imran. We all know that autocrats make a lot of myths, right? And how do you get out of that myth? And there is, of course, the nature of statistics and everything else, evidence that we have in Bangladesh, particularly from government agencies. It's quite difficult to know where the truth lies, right? So that's a very important task. I have a question for Adnan, and then it's also a question for you, Imran, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Adnan, to you, my question is about how do you see sort of the youth engaging, and what are their aspirations? They played a huge role in transition. Their role is now being discussed in terms of, well, they lack experience, but they might lack experience, but they provided us that inspiration and that momentum, which us adults lacked, right? So how do you see their role shaping up? I know there's been some conversation around the youth floating a separate political party. We have always been a bipartisan, our politics has always been bipartisan. It's like cricket, right? This party bats, then the other party gets into power and 5 years go away. Do you see it changing? So that is the question for you. And then Imran, because you're part of the white paper committee, but you're also sitting in other conversations, and you raised the question about deliberative democracy. Do you see the space holding in terms of deliberation? Because people are quite impatient. People are also can be quite intolerant. Just because they have participated in an uprising doesn't necessarily mean that the culture immediately changes. So where do you see the possibilities in terms of deliberation and local level engagement, and that sort of moving up? So Adnan, you first, then Imran.
Yeah. Okay. So overall, I think the youth of Bangladesh has always been very politically active and aware. But there has been a change in terms of the conversations that happen in tea stalls, over dinner tables, and so on. All right. Previously, when we were growing up, we used to watch our elders, our uncles discussing politics all the time. But now is the youth doing that. So there is that aspect of it, right? In terms of aspirations, some of the things that have been happening right now, just today before coming, one of the the youth organizers, he put out a statement in terms of all the people that were affected during the movement and are right now hospitalized or are blind because of the shells. what kind of support they're getting. And it's been quite a few months since that happened, but why are they not getting the due support from the government that they should be getting? So it's spaces like this where their voices are still active, and actively participating in rebuilding the institutions. They have moved back a bit. At least in terms of the voices that are happening right now, Mirban Bhai can actually allude to this better if they have a strong voice within the White Paper Committee or not. But what they are really active in is in terms of identifying the different locuses and the different institutions where their problems are still remaining and it's still happening. And it's going to be a lengthy process. They are impatient. But a lot of them are very patient. They know that it's going to be a lengthy process. This is something that cannot be fixed in a year or two. This is 50 years, 15 years of dominance and manipulating different institutions. So they realize that it's going to take years to be able to get to some point. The other aspect, I think, one of the big conversations happening in the social media space, which might be exaggerated, might not be, I'm not entirely sure, is in terms of who's going to come to power next, right? In terms of the elections, when it might happen, how long this interim government is going to stay, should stay. Are we going to see Jamaat coming back to power is one of the big questions that a lot of, so Jamaat is a Islamic government, essentially. It's one of the political parties in Bangladesh. And there's a big conversation, especially among upper middle class females in terms of fearing an Islamic government replacing the government that we just ousted, right? So those conversations, those fears are there. But at the same time, if there is going to be democracy, we need these conversations out into the space. One of the things that has been pointed out by the youth repeatedly is that in the past 15 years, we know that the elections were rigged. We know who was going to come into power. So these conversations never took place in terms of what's going to happen in the future. Now there is that uncertainty, and that uncertainty, I think, is contributing partly to the gap that Imran Bhai mentioned. But also, it's very lively in terms of the discussion. Some people are afraid, some people are very aspirational, they are optimistic in terms of good changes coming about. But you see that entire range now that was missing previously among the youth. Some of the things that do need to happen is that we have seen that education has taken quite a big backlash during COVID and during this movement. There are a number of steps taken by the government that I don't agree with in terms of how they dealt with this situation, but that's a personal factor. But at the same time, one of the key things that we will need to do is reinvest into the education sector, make sure that gets up and running and properly established once again. Because I feel like that, and a lot of the youth also agree on this, at least my students, that there is a lapse in terms of how that is, the reversal of that, if I should use the word at all.
Yes, education will be a key sector to look at, partly because not just that people have missed out on classes during COVID or during Uprising, the universities were closed, but it's also about the quality of it, the way it has been undermined in terms of critical thinking and because universities and also schools are a place where you learn how to debate and dissent and critically think. And if that's undermined, then, what would your future citizens look like? But from the looks of it from July, it seems like actually the Gen Z is quite fine. Yeah. It's the adults who need fixing. But it's also sustaining that momentum, right? And also bringing in the experience of running institutions, running administration, which the youth are now going to gain, right? But also including them in the process. So Imran.
Yeah, so no, you talked about deliberation, deliberative democracy. Now, I think, I think there are two slogans that, everybody has to have their, favorite slogans during this movement. I mean, for me, they're not really slogan, but I think two words that really, or terms. So one is in Bangla, it says Kotha Ko. There was a whole Shezan song, rap song on Kotha Ko, which means speak up. And this is so powerful. This was the most liberating, powerful expression, after 15 years of not being able to speak, and this rap number really captured that energy and that claiming of that space of speaking up, right? So this was one, and the other one is again in Bangla. It's a bit slangish. It basically and it's now been used in many different ways. It basically the word was deshta karo baper na. The country is nobody's father's. And there are many interpretation of this from father because, the previous Sheikh Hasina's father was Bangabandhu and all that. But it speaks to a much wider aspiration of breaking away from a privilege hierarchy-based and kind of that type of my father, my uncle, that type of a way of thinking about power or exerting power. And I think these two, if we can really capture the energy of these two, to speak up and to always be bold to say that this is not about your father. You are not privileged. You do not have the privilege, to sort of demand certain things. It's not about privilege. It's about citizens' rights. And I think if we can get to that, I think that's going to be our construction of rule of law, right? So I think I really found these two extremely powerful. In terms of deliberative, of course, I mean, we are a very deliberative society in many ways, but whenever it comes to formal conversations, we actually do not know how to deliberate. So we are simultaneously extremely good in deliberation and extremely bad in deliberation, right? And this is about us, our power of our informality, which we totally lose when we come to a formal spaces and formal policies and formal mechanisms. So I think we need to really draw on our strength of informality. We are fantastic in terms of local deliberations, but we need to bring those design ideas into the formal space of policies, processes, institutions, and so on and so forth. And I think that's how we sort of build our approach to deliberative democracy, which has to be very distinct.
So it's basically organically developing, right, in terms of how you think about democratic practices. All right, I am going to sort of bring the moderated discussion to a close here and open it up to the floor in terms of question and answers. We are very informal here, so raise your hand, ask your question. You can say who you want to ask the question to, or whether you're asking to both of them. Anything? Anybody? Or do we have something online here? Yeah? I'm without glasses. Okay. Ooh. Okay. Okay, this is to either of you. The first question is basically, can you speak to the threat of an Islamist future in Bangladesh? Adnan, you did touch on that, right? In terms of whether this is basically Islamophobia and people are just being Islamophobic, or is the threat kind of real, right? Partly because the past regime did use Islamophobia as a mean to sort of legitimate why they need to stay in power, because the claim that Awami League had was that they represent secular ideals, right? Do you want to take this on?
Yeah. This is a touchy one now. As you mentioned, over the past years, there has been a massive repression in terms of the voice of the different Islamic parties that we do have. So one of the points that I want to stress on is, if we are going to move on to a democratic space where all voices will be valued, their voices need to be heard. It's not like we should go and repress them. We should not do that. Their voices need to come out. But tied with that is, of course, that fear of having an Islamic government. Historically speaking, and given the culture and the institutions that we have in Bangladesh, personally, I do not think that is what is going to happen, primarily because in the last fair elections that we did have, the number of seats won by Jamaat was very low, right? But we also have to realize that there is a new train of thought among the younger generation in terms of how they view Islam and religion as part of a political party. And that is what is bringing out all these conversations. But also at the same time, there is this fear in terms of increased I don't want to say intimate partner violence, but essentially violence against women on the streets in terms of harassment. And these issues have come out in social media. I do not think that they reflect the entirety of Bangladesh, of course, but incidents like that do tend to catch on social media simply because of that emotion sentiment factor. And that has been spreading quite a bit, right? At least from the data that we scraped, as far as we can tell, that sentiment is not there in rural areas or among the lower socioeconomic classes, but mostly in the upper middle classes. That sentiment is present, and but it is going to be a process, and if it is going to be a democratic process, you have to at least listen to what they're saying, and it will unfold over time. But given the one of the questions that I often get is Bangladesh going to have an Islamic government in the future in terms of what's happening to many countries? The institutions of Bangladesh are so different, and the culture is so different. It doesn't seem likely to me that that is something that we should be legitimately afraid of or use that as an excuse to dominate over them. That space needs to be created for conversation. And if you're going to move ahead in terms of that, conversations need to be held. And in terms of the government, the advisory government that was created, I think they've created that space for that conversation to be held as well, because we do have representatives within there, right?
Thanks, Adnan. It's a difficult question, always to answer, and it's a complex situation. Just wanted to draw attention, which you talked about, is that we don't have data from free and fair election, right? We have first past the post system, but the Islamist parties who have participated in elections never won more than 8% of the vote. They were never the popular choice. But at the same time, a lot of people in Bangladesh are religious. Religion does play an important role in people's private lives, including in my family's life. But I've never been told by my family members that you can't go out to work, you have to dress in a certain way, blah, blah, blah. Different families are different. So it's important to think through what are people's personal choices in terms of expressions of religiosity? Where are the organized forces that we think about in terms of religious forces? What are their public policy preferences, right? There are preferences in that may be about certain kinds of laws. There may be, but Sharia already is in practice in terms of religious personal laws. So for example, in Bangladesh, if your marriage, divorce, guardianship, etc., is ruled by basically whichever religion you belong to, not necessarily that everyone has to follow Muslim Sharia law. If you're a Hindu, you follow Hindu family law. So it varies, right? But at the same time, if the question is that the civil law needs to be changed, I don't think majority of Bangladeshis would go and endorse that. That has never been that kind of conversation. But at the same time, as you say, if it's going to be a democracy, you will need to listen to all parties and you will have to debate that. But there will still be a debate, I hope. Yerker, you had a question.
Yeah, so thank you. So I'm Yerker Estrom, work with Suhaila on countering backlash and with partners in Bangladesh, including JPG, also with BRAC University. So yeah, this is fascinating, really, really fascinating stuff. I was really intrigued by the data point as well and the opinion shifts. And for me, there is so much resonance with what's going on in Bangladesh, now that I'm hearing you, with what goes on in other countries, of course, like the United States as we speak, like in Germany, Sweden. And one of the intriguing things about the registers of pessimism, if you like, between the gender base, if I understand rightly, urban middle-class women more pessimistic than the rural, perhaps. And also, I'm wondering a bit about the men in relation to this, because so much of this politics, particularly the oppressive politics, drawing on that notions of fatherland and you know, what I see, the two slogans you mentioned, what I see as basically a reaction to patriarchy. This is about oppressive patriarchal ways of operating. Sorry, I'm digressing a bit. So, have there been much discussion about men's disaffection and crisis of masculinity, if you like, in Bangladesh, perhaps particularly in urban Bangladesh, where those most pessimistic women are directly exposed to men's crises, perhaps, or resentments or worries. Is that part of this discourse? And how do you think that? I mean, I'd see the mirror image in India, perhaps, in terms of the way that the Hindu nationalist agenda is whipping up this kind of male resentment against minorities and so on, and women. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can quickly. Oh, sorry, I do have a mic. Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I'll come at it, you know, as sort of more as an economist. No, so what we do see from different surveys is, the classic patriarchal bargain keeps on getting negotiated and renegotiated. I mean, we keep on seeing this in Bangladesh. 74 famine was a big one, and Naila has written a lot on this, and I think the COVID also, and subsequent to COVID, the classic patriarchal bargain again started, one of the reasons why it was more difficult for women to get back to work was basically because the priority was always men has to basically first find work. And the search for work needs investment. So once women are back into the home, that needs to be really prioritized, because first men has to really get the work, and then it's secondary and supplementary if women gets to work at all or not. So I think from that point of view, it's become, and we see this in our labor force data, increasingly for educated younger men, it is much more difficult to basically get the kind of job they want. Those jobs are not there, or they're not really adequately prepared to take on those jobs. So there are levels of mismatches in the upper segment, tertiary graduate labor market segment, right? And that is why this whole movement, ultimately the whole uprising started off with a positive liberty issue. It was discrimination in government jobs. It was a positive liberty issue. The negative liberty came in much later, and then of course created the big uprising, right? But the issue was a positive liberty issue. So we should never forget, I mean, we get really, really excited about the negative liberty issues, it's really important, but we should never, where we are in Bangladesh right now, is we have to take the positive liberty and negative liberty issues both extremely seriously. The last 15, 16 years, we've been really focused on a positive liberty-oriented explanation of where we are and why your Faustian bargains were being, accepted, right? Now we're in a reality where both positive and negative liberty people care about both. And any political future will need to ensure that they are addressing the challenges of both positive freedom and negative freedom.
Thanks, Imran. Kate has a question.
Thanks. Yeah, so my name's Kate Bruce, research fellow at IDS. So it's really interesting and valuable to get these insights and what's been happening in Bangladesh and looking forwards. And I know that at this point, it's a lot about existential questions about democracy, about whose voices are heard, who's involved. I was wondering if at this point, particularly because there's an interim government, whether there's also policy discussions, what the kind of policy implications are of this transition and what's happening, now and possibly into the future. And also with Mohammed Yunus as the interim head of government, whether that, as the founder of Grameen Bank, that has any implications. Imran Bhai, you mentioned microcredits, which has been so important. So around these kind of policy issues, social protection, what's happening, or is it just sort of on hold because of all these bigger questions? Thank you.
So is it going to change business as usual, or?
When you want to start, I can take on later. Why don't you?
Okay. Yeah. So this is some of the work that I've been in some of my other work in Bangladesh tied to social protection. Some of it has been on hold, but they are resuming. As we speak right now, those conversations are back on the board. Some of the first conversation was on the social registry that was being developed in Bangladesh, the project that did not come to a fruition and received a lot of backlash. So essentially, like in other Latin American countries, there was an attempt to create that social registry in Bangladesh, but that did not fall through. So there are conversations happening in terms of, can that be revived or not? Is it worthwhile to be revived? In terms of, we know that during COVID, so the present situation from the LFS is, we know that even though it shows that overall female employment has gone up, that has mostly happened from self-employment in rural areas. In urban areas, that has gone down post-COVID. And there was a massive reverse migration from urban areas to rural areas post-COVID, a lot from RMG factories, ready-made garment factories, for females who have lost their jobs and did not manage to get back into labor force employment. So there are talks in terms of how we can bring them back into employment, whether they at all want to come back into employment or not. In terms of renegotiating the social safety net structure, that is a conversation I haven't heard happening widely, but I think that's something that Imran Bhai can comment on much better.
Yeah, so I mean, right now, I think there are these kind of, much more macro level reform agenda that is a top priority. But I really think that the micro and meso realities or the constraints there need to be paid attention to very urgently. And, since COVID, poor people have been suffering in Bangladesh. And I think it's all gotten worse with the rising inflation, which is still, is unabated. So more medium-term measures such as market reform and competition policies are very important, to address syndicate and all that stuff. But I think immediately there has to be kind of immediate pro-poor relief measures, such as expanding the open market sale, expanding the employment guarantee program that we basically have. Those type of immediate relief program that we basically have within our social protection basket need to be expanded significantly right now, because I think otherwise this itself can create another big risk. Because again, this is a positive liberty issue. We should not forget that people care about lives and livelihoods, and they care about their rights to be able to speak as well. So we need to really work on both simultaneously. I really hope the interim government will pay attention to that quickly. But related to this is, one of the many reform commissions, one of the areas of, I think, very urgent reform, which I would have liked to see, is a local government reform, because that is fundamental to poor people's lives and livelihood, right? And our local governance has been, one of the most, one of the government and governance mechanisms that have been totally corrupted, by politicizing it. So I think, kind of getting that to work in a more competitive, fairer, and democratic way, I think would yield great benefits to poor people, but would be central to the positive liberty and positive freedom delivery, service delivery challenge that any political government will have to take forward.
Okay, so we have a few questions and I know we will have to wrap up. So there's a question at the back. So if you would ask your question and then Rashad has a question and you have a question. We'll take all three questions and you guys can choose who wants to answer that.
Yeah, hello. So my name is Neela, and I've have experience of living in rural area of Bangladesh. And I was going to ask you about how I know that Upazila chairman or union chairman are either part of Army League or BNP. So I was going to ask you like how it's affected them in local governance right now. Like what's the scenario it's like? Because I also agree with you about like there is a reformation needed for like local government. So yeah, I just wanted to ask that.
Okay, so can we sort of get rid of partisan politics in local government? Is that going to happen? Rashad.
Thanks. My question is about sort of the transition to a proper inclusive democracy. And I think there are sort of two elements here that I'd like to ask you to explore. When I was working for the Asia Foundation back in the day, I was shocked to learn that, Adam, do correct me if this has changed, but there's a constitutional prohibition on floor crossing. So MPs are not allowed to vote against the party without triggering an automatic by-election. So you lose your seat in parliament if you vote against your party. So we understand from Asimoglu and all that you want consolidation of power, right? You need that monopoly of violence, but you also want inclusive institutions that protect sort of others, and you want checks and balances. I think we've done a great job on consolidating power. Checks and balances, though, right? Where are they in Bangladesh's agenda to transition? Who has the incentives to put checks and balances in place? And our language of power has a lot to do with power, but not much to do with duty. So the vice chancellors of the universities where students were being slaughtered, the police, all of these institutions exercise power. There was no duty of care. What can we do to codify and institutionalize checks and balances and duty of care in our institution?
Hi, I'm Sapantara. I am a student here in MA Development Studies. So I'm from India, and I have a reflection first is that we had a lot of misinformation and disinformation coming into India, because I feel like with the Citizenship Amendment Act that has been implemented but not enforced in India, I feel all of the misinformation kind of made the foundation strong in a way to demand for a country that has the Citizenship Amendment Act, and the act in itself is an Islamophobic act, if you will. So I feel like that kind of solidified the foundation. At least that was the try within the sovereignty of our nation. Another question is that I'm from Assam. I am from the northeastern part of India, wherein the discourse of migration from Bangladesh into India is a very strong topic, and it has a negative noise around it. So when I think of the migration, I usually think that it happens because the population density, economic issues, or political persecution. I want to be validated on that thought if I'm right or wrong. And I want to understand how, when reconstructing Bangladesh now, that would be engaged with.
Irene wants to ask a question. Okay, you guys get to choose what you answer, right?
Migration, migration to
Last one, make it short.
About the education system, Adnan did touch on it, but my question, any of you can answer definitely. My question is about the government. We know 15 years is a long time. They have tried to discourage the political activism through the national curriculum. They have tried to, kind of brainwash. So is the reversal of this brainwashing system on the agenda currently now that the white paper is being developed? Thanks.
Okay, so change in national curriculum. Are we going to get rid of all the hagiography and have a kind of a picture that gives you, because history has been rewritten so many times by both parties, both BNP, Army League, and then you just don't know what the history is, right? So it's about that, right? and education plays a key role. It's about cross-border migration and kind of what's the real picture, right? Why are people migrating? Although borders have always been porous with Assam and people went this way and that way. And that's how it is for livelihood. I mean, that's how I would see it. Any pointers on that in terms of migration? I mean, I know India-Bangladesh relation is at a touchy point. And if I may say so, there's been a lot of misinformation, disinformation campaign from Indian side, and India has had supported an autocratic government for a long, long time and looked the other way, starting from 2014 elections. So it's not an easy kind of issue to talk about, along with rise of BJP and Hindutva. And then, of course, we have our own conservative groups, right? So it's a tricky conversation there. And then there's the bit in terms of local government.
Yeah.
And then there's the bit that Russia asked in terms of
The very big bit, yeah.
Yes.
So let me, yeah. So I think on the local government, I mean, that's how it used to be. People, competitors voting for local elections on the national party symbols was a recent thing, and I think that can be changed. But I think just changing that is not enough. I mean, I think there's a lot more that real devolution of power that needs to basically happen. Bangladesh is a big country, 170 million people. We are an extremely heterogeneous, diverse country, and our local economies are extremely diverse. And we need to really get to much more localized approach to economic growth and economic development. And that requires very strong local government with a lot more devolved authority and power. So I think that's the principle. And I think we have never really taken that very seriously. We have paid lip service to actually providing power to the local authorities. And then we kept on taking away whatever we basically gave and tried to politicize it and make it as a part of a central kind of electoral politics of the national elections. So I think that needs to really change. So there's a lot more than just people using national political party symbols to vote. That is a very small part of it. That changing is easy, but that is not really going to get us to where we need to get to in terms of the kind of much more localized economic development strategy and agenda for Bangladesh. Now, in terms of, your question is really, I think, very fundamental. And I think what's happening is, so there is a constitution reform. And I think these are some of the things they are going to be looking at. I think there's been discussion with the political parties recently. But I think, there isn't, none of the political parties other than, BNP apparently doesn't want the bicameral system. So that's very clear. I think that's, if I remember correctly, on the bicameral, the smaller parties want a bicameral system with the upper house perhaps having more proportional representation type of a system of representation and having much stronger kind of checks and balance to ensure that constitutional reform and other types of very important independent body appointments can actually require the kind of approval from both the houses. So those types of check and balance are being talked about. I don't think we have yet a political cross-party political agreement in terms of how we move forward on those. But I think those are the conversation that's basically happening. And Article 70, I think, is basically called that floor crossing is another of the point. And I think all the political parties, I think, are in agreement in terms of taking that out. But I think the Constitution is where many of these conversations are happening, constitutional reform. But I think much more fundamental conversation also needs to happen is how do we also create more consequential social accountability mechanisms, people-centered consequential social accountability mechanisms. And because we cannot trust the politicians, they are going to try and reverse things as soon as they get into political power. I mean, we have to take that as sort of given. No matter how much irreversibility we may design, they will find some ways of, trying to, kind of reverse it. Hopefully, we can get to some irreversibility in the design, but that will happen. So what we need also is consequential social accountability, which perhaps can link up with if you have a bicameral system with the upper house, so that you have representation from these type of more people's assembly and people's accountability mechanisms way up onto the sort of upper house, and you give more authority there to ensure that for big questions, national questions, and big independent body reform or appointments, you have their voice very strongly heard. I think approaching so I'll just make 2 points. So one is, I think we cannot just rely on formal within the system accountability structures for us to move forward. We need, what I think at BIGD, my colleague Mirza Hassan is calling dual power structure. We need a citizen-centric, almost a dual power structure that can hold to account, that can create the checks and balance and hold to account the sort of the structured vertical accountability structure that we basically have. And that has to basically have consequence. And how do we create that consequentiality is going to be the real matter of debate. How do we design? There's almost a dual power structure that is apolitical. How do we keep it non-partisan political? How do we design this? It is a design challenge. And how do we give it teeth is going to be really important, because we just cannot rely only on our political masters for our future.
Okay, 2 points there. One is, of course, it's always a design question, right? We are at IDS, we look at design, but design is important. The other bit is, of course, if you want democracy and liberty, the price is you also have to be vigilant as citizens. You can't just say, well, someone else will do it. Yes, someone else is there, but you also need to be actively engaged. Having said that, Adnan, do you want to take the
migration?
Yeah, I'll take the migration and the education. In terms of migration, you're right. It has been porous ever since the countries were formed, right? So we've been having that cross migration historically, and you have identified the main reasons exactly. It's mostly economic in terms of what's happening, the peer migration that has been going on, the livelihood case. But there's always that political angle to migration. And one of the fears that we were just discussing this a few days ago is how this migration is going to be politicized even more in the coming days, given the rising tensions. And there hasn't, at least not that I am aware of, there hasn't been any policy level discussions about this in terms of how this can be managed or what approaches should be taken. But that fear is acknowledged in terms of this might become highly politicized in the coming days if the rising tensions continue. Okay, so I don't have an exact answer for you, but I know that this has been brought up in conversations. In terms of the education one, that is a big topic in Bangladesh right now after the committee was formed. And we know that, so what happened in Bangladesh is there was an education reform committee formed, essentially looking at the curriculum, but they did not have representation from all the communities. And one of the points that was raised is that why is there not a religious scholar present in that community? And that led to backlashes, but it has been formed. Some members have to move out, some members did come in, and they are looking into essentially reforming the syllabus that was recently changed, right? It's not been that long. And we know that a lot of the cultural tenets has been removed from the syllabus in terms of poems and literature in terms of the recent revision. And there are talks in terms of bringing some of those back. In fact, there is supposed to be a panel 2 days from now, which kind of touches on what the conversations are going to be. So it's in process, and we'll eventually see where that leads to. But yes, reforming the curriculum, especially primary and secondary education, that is going to be a massive topic moving forward. And it's also going to have spillovers into the political discussion because we know that Hafazat, which is another Islamic party, they do have a strong voice in terms of how they want to see that happening. So there's going to be a dual conversation from all sides. Yeah.
And if I may just add, I mean, I think for many of these conversations we've been having, be it on constitutional matters and how we look at our, I mean, curriculum is a site of, it's a very active site of all types of contestation. It's how we shape minds, right, of our next generation. It's really important. But we have to learn how to have national conversations on these issues, right? I mean, we don't, at the moment we come to policy, we don't know how to have national conversation and public engagement. And I really think we need to really figure out how we can, and this needs to be designed carefully. I mean, it's not just going and talking to people. It needs to be really designed, thought through carefully. How do we kind of orchestrate this? How do we design the conversation? How do we take the inputs? How do we boil it down? How do we again take it back to people? So this process of designing deliberation, I think, has to be the most important thing we need to really do right now.
Okay, so we are way past, and I'm going to bring this to a close in the sense, and you are right, Imran, that the point is, if we do want democracy, you can't just say, well, democracy is great, but then it's going to be just whatever that I want. It's never what I want. There are other people there, and you will have to talk to them and come to a consensus. And it's not also about what they want. It is a discussion. You have to listen to everyone. You have to create and hold that space, and you have to be patient, right? But the important thing is the process inclusive? Do people get to participate? Do people get to talk? Are you respectful in terms of hearing? So you can't just label people, just as we can't label people. The other side also cannot be labeling us as something else. So it's about creating that kind of culture of listening, and we have a lot to learn, because a lot of the time our focus on democratic process has been the electoral process and electoral democracy, and we know that that is not what democracy is. So let's hope this time it will be different. We want this time to be different. We are hopeful, but we are also cautious because we have also missed chances previously, right? We as, I mean, in terms of Bangladeshis, but thank you both for such stimulating conversation.
Thank you very much.
And could we have a round of applause for the audience? You guys have been incredibly patient and your questions have been brilliant. Thank you all so much.